Clearwater, a routine traffic stop turns into a nightmare when Officer Logan Miller brutally assaults Aurora Carter, a black woman, in front of her 11-year-old daughter. What Officer Miller doesn't know is that Aurora is married to Dominic Carter, the town's revered police captain. As protests erupt and the town demands justice, Dominic finds himself caught between the system he's dedicated his life to and his family's need for justice. As Dominic digs deeper into the incident, he uncovers a far-reaching conspiracy within the Clearwater Police Department, revealing years of corruption and cover-ups. What began as a personal fight for justice transforms into a high-stakes battle to expose the truth with his career, his family, and the future of Clearwater on the line. But in a town where loyalty to the badge runs deep, Dominic soon realizes that no one is who they seem, and the cost of justice may be more than he's willing to pay. As the lines between right and wrong blur, will Dominic be able to save his family and take down the system, or will the truth destroy everything he holds dear? Shadows of Justice is a powerful story of love, betrayal, and the fight for truth that will leave you questioning the cost of doing what's right. The afternoon sun hung low over Clearwater, casting long shadows across the streets, as Aurora Carter drove home with her 11-year-old daughter Ruby in the back seat. The radio hummed softly in the background, mixing with the sounds of Ruby's animated chatter about school. "Mom, guess what? Missy. Colin said my drawing was the best in class." Ruby's eyes sparkled in the rearview mirror. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Aurora replied, smiling warmly. "I always knew you were an artist." Ruby grinned and looked out the window. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful, ordinary. But then, the sudden flash of blue lights in Aurora's rearview mirror shattered the calm. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Ruby's voice trembled. "I'm sure it's just a mistake, baby," Aurora said, her hands tightening on the steering wheel as she pulled over to the side of the road. She glanced into the mirror again, heart racing. "Stay calm." Aurora rolled down her window as Officer Logan Miller approached the car, his face set in a grim, unfriendly expression. The crunch of his boots against the asphalt sent a shiver down her spine. "License and registration," Miller barked, not bothering with any formalities. Aurora fumbled for her documents, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed them over. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You were going 5 miles over the speed limit," he replied, his tone cold. "I didn't realize," Aurora began, but the words died in her throat as Miller leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "License and registration," he repeated, more forcefully this time. Ruby shifted nervously in the back seat, her small voice breaking the tension. "Mom, is everything okay?" That innocent question was enough to set Miller off. Without warning, he swung his arm, striking Aurora hard across the face. The world tilted as pain shot through her cheek, and Aurora gasped, clutching her face in shock. "Mom!" Ruby screamed, unbuckling her seatbelt and scrambling toward the front. "Stay in the car," Miller growled, his face unmoved by what he had just done. He turned and walked back to his patrol car as though nothing had happened. The air in the car felt heavy and oppressive as Aurora tried to collect herself. Her vision blurred with tears, both from the pain and the humiliation of being struck in front of her daughter. Ruby's sobs filled the small space, each one a knife twisting deeper into Aurora's heart. "Mom, what happened?" Ruby whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, baby," Aurora said, her voice shaking. "But it's over now. We're going to be okay." But as she drove home in silence, her cheek still throbbing from the blow, Aurora knew nothing was okay, and things were about to get much worse. Aurora parked in the driveway, her hand still trembling on the steering wheel. Ruby had been quiet the entire ride, curled up in the back seat, hugging her knees. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on Aurora's chest. "Come on, sweetie," she said softly, glancing back at her daughter. "Let's go inside." Ruby didn't respond, her face pale and drawn. Aurora's heart ached, seeing the fear in her little girl's eyes. She stepped out of the car and opened the back door, gently taking Ruby's hand as they walked toward the house. Inside, the familiar warmth of their home did little to ease Aurora's tension. She closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment, closing her eyes. Dominic wasn't home yet, still working late at the Clearwater Police Department, no doubt. How could she even begin to tell him what had happened? Ruby sat down at the kitchen table, silent, staring at her hands. Aurora knelt beside her, gently brushing a tear from Ruby's cheek. "Baby, it's okay. You're safe now. Why did he hit you?" Ruby's voice was barely a whisper, filled with confusion and fear. "I don't know, Ruby," Aurora answered, her own voice cracking. "But I promise you, I'm going to make sure this never happens again." But as the words left her mouth, a new fear gripped her. Telling Dominic meant dragging him into a nightmare. How could he face this? He was a police captain, respected in the community. What would it mean for him if people knew one of his officers had assaulted his wife? Aurora stood up, her mind racing. She had to protect Ruby. She had to protect Dominic. But as she glanced at her reflection in the hallway mirror, the bruise forming on her cheek, she knew she couldn't hide the truth for long. Hours passed before Dominic returned home, exhausted after a long day at the station. As soon as he walked through the door, Aurora's heart began to race. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. "Hey, love," Dominic said, his voice warm but tired as he walked into the kitchen. "You and Ruby have a good day?" Aurora swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "Dominic, we need to talk." Her tone made him stop in his tracks. His eyes narrowed in concern as he walked toward her, noticing the tension in her posture. Then he saw the bruise. "Aurora." His voice dropped, laced with alarm. "What happened to your face?" Tears welled in her eyes as she met his gaze. I was pulled over by one of your officers, Logan Miller. He hit me." The color drained from Dominic's face. He took a step back, his fists clenching at his sides. "He what?" "In front of Ruby," Aurora continued, her voice trembling. He hit me. I don't even know why." Dominic's jaw tightened, his eyes dark with anger. He turned away, pacing the kitchen as he processed what he had just heard. One of his own men, someone he trusted, had assaulted his wife. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but only one thing mattered now. "I'll handle it," Dominic said, his voice low and determined. "I'll make sure he pays for what he's done." "Dominic, wait." Aurora's hand reached out, but he was already storming toward the door. She could see the rage in his eyes, the conflict tearing at him. "Please think about this." He stopped, his hand on the doorknob, breathing heavily. "How am I supposed to think about this? One of my men put his hands on you, Aurora. I can't just sit here." Aurora shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I know, but this isn't just about us. You have to be careful. This could destroy everything." Dominic turned slowly, his face softening as he looked at her. He walked back over, cupping her face gently in his hands, his thumb brushing over the bruise. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I won't let this go." The next morning, Dominic sat at his desk in the Clearwater Police Department, staring at his computer screen. The usual hum of the station buzzed around him, but all he could focus on was the file in front of him, Officer Logan Miller's personnel records. He clicked through the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. On the surface, Miller's records seemed clean, too clean. But as Dominic dug deeper, he noticed something unsettling. Complaints, small, scattered reports of misconduct, excessive force during traffic stops, particularly involving minority citizens. Every one of them quietly closed, marked unsubstantiated. "Why am I not surprised?" Dominic muttered under his breath, scrolling through the files. He knew the signs. He had seen it before. Officers protecting their own, keeping things buried to maintain the department's image. But this was different. This was personal. As he continued his investigation, a knot tightened in his stomach. This wasn't just about one bad officer. It was a pattern, a systemic failure. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized just how high the corruption might go. Dominic leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't just up against Miller now. He was up against the entire system. Meanwhile, Aurora sat across from Monica Gaines, a sharp-eyed civil rights lawyer who had built a reputation for taking on cases of police misconduct. The two women sat in the lawyer's small office, papers spread across the table between them. "You're sure you want to go through with this?" Monica asked, her voice calm but firm. "Once we file this complaint, there's no going back." Aurora nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her bruised cheek. "I don't have a choice. He can't get away with this." Monica gave her a sympathetic smile. "You're right, but it's going to be hard, Aurora, especially with Dominic being the captain. This could get messy." "I know," Aurora said, her voice resolute. "But I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for Ruby, for everyone who's been through this and stayed silent." Monica nodded, her expression serious. "All right then, let's get started." As they began preparing the legal paperwork, Aurora felt the weight of the decision settle over her. She knew this was only the beginning, and the battle ahead would be long and difficult. But she wasn't backing down. Not this time. The quiet of Dominic Carter's office at the Clearwater Police Department was a stark contrast to the storm raging in his mind. He sat behind his desk, staring at the blank computer screen in front of him, struggling to wrap his mind around the impossible choice he now faced. His wife had been assaulted by one of his own officers, Officer Logan Miller. Dominic had sworn to uphold the law, to protect the people of Clearwater, and yet, now the law had betrayed him in the most personal way possible. How was he supposed to be the man who held the line for justice when the very system he believed in was crumbling? A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Hugo Thompson, his second in command and the only person in the department he truly trusted, entered. "Dominic, I've been hearing things. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. He looked up, his expression hard, jaw tight. "No, I'm not. It's Aurora, Miller." He attacked her. Hugo's eyes widened in shock. "What? Are you serious? How could this happen?" Dominic clenched his fists, fighting to keep his emotions in check. "I don't know. But I have to do something, Hugo. And I have to make sure it's done right." Hugo nodded slowly, taking a seat across from him. "I know you will. But this is going to get messy. The department is going to push back hard if you go after one of our own." "I'm not just going after one of our own," Dominic said, his voice firm. "I'm going after corruption. If Miller did this, how many others have been covered up?" Hugo frowned. "You're thinking it's bigger than just Miller?" "I'm starting to. I can feel it. This department has kept things quiet for too long, and I've been blind to it." Dominic's voice grew quieter. "But now it's personal." Hugo leaned forward, her voice steady but filled with worry. "Dominic, I'm with you, but you need to tread carefully. If you start digging, you could be going up against more than just a rogue officer. You could be risking everything, your career, your reputation." He met her gaze, his resolve clear. "I don't care about my career. I care about my family." Later that day, as Dominic began reviewing the complaints filed against Officer Miller, the air in the department felt thick with tension. Whispers followed him as he walked down the halls, and eyes that used to greet him with respect now avoided his gaze. Word had already begun to spread that Dominic was digging into Miller's conduct, and not everyone was pleased. As Dominic passed by a group of officers near the break room, he heard the murmured voices, too quiet to catch every word, but enough to feel the hostility. His stomach turned, but he pushed on, determined to stay focused. Just as he reached his office, he was intercepted by Deputy Chief Bella Ford. Her sharp blue eyes locked onto him, her expression unreadable. "Dominic, a word," she said, motioning for him to follow her into a nearby conference room. Once inside, Bella closed the door behind them, folding her arms across her chest. "I've heard you've been looking into Officer Miller." Dominic's heart pounded, but he kept his face neutral. There are some things that need to be addressed." Bella sighed, shaking her head. "I know what happened to Aurora was awful, but you need to be careful. The department can't afford any more public scrutiny right now." He stared at her, disbelief washing over him. "This isn't about public scrutiny, Bella. This is about one of our officers assaulting an innocent woman, my wife." Her expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "Dominic, I understand how personal this is for you, but you know how these things work. There's a process. You file the complaints and let internal affairs handle it. You can't start tearing down your own department." Dominic felt a cold anger rising in his chest. "If we don't clean up the department ourselves, then who will? You can't ask me to sit by and let this go." Bella's eyes narrowed. "I'm not asking you to let it go. I'm asking you to follow protocol. We can't have a captain undermining the very system he's sworn to uphold. Think about the bigger picture." "I am thinking about the bigger picture," Dominic replied, his voice steady. "And right now the bigger picture looks rotten from the inside out." Bella straightened, her face hardening. "Be careful, Dominic. You're walking a fine line." As Dominic wrestled with the internal battles at the department, the town of Clearwater was beginning to stir. News of the assault had spread quickly, and Aurora's decision to file a formal complaint against Officer Miller had sparked outrage in the community. By the end of the week, protests had begun to form in front of the police station, with signs demanding justice for Aurora and accountability from the Clearwater Police Department. Aurora stood in the living room, watching the news coverage of the protests. A mix of emotions swirled within her. Relief that people were speaking out, but also fear for what it might mean for her family. Ruby sat on the couch beside her, her knees pulled up to her chest, eyes glued to the screen. "Mom, why are they holding those signs?" Ruby asked, her voice small. Aurora took a deep breath, kneeling beside her daughter. "They're standing up for what's right, honey. They want to make sure that no one else gets hurt like I did." "Are they mad at Dad?" Ruby's voice wavered with uncertainty. Aurora shook her head, pulling Ruby into her arms. "No, baby. They're not mad at Dad. They're mad at the people who hurt us." Ruby looked up at her, her big brown eyes filled with worry. "Is Dad going to be okay?" Aurora kissed her forehead gently. "Your dad is one of the bravest people I know. He's doing everything he can to make sure we're all safe." But deep down, Aurora wasn't sure if even Dominic could shield them from what was coming next. Later that evening, the house felt quieter than usual. Dominic was still at the station, trying to make sense of the tangled web he had begun to uncover. Aurora sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea as Ruby picked at her dinner. The silence between them felt heavy. It was clear that Ruby was struggling, though she hadn't said much since the assault. Her usual bright, bubbly personality had dimmed, and the once easy conversations between mother and daughter had become strained. "Ruby," Aurora began softly, "do you want to talk about what happened?" Ruby shook her head, staring down at her plate. Aurora's heart ached. She reached across the table, gently taking her daughter's hand. "It's okay to be scared. I'm scared too." Ruby's eyes welled with tears. "I don't want him to hurt you again, Mom." Aurora's chest tightened, and she stood up, walking around the table to kneel beside Ruby. "No one is going to hurt us again. I promise you, sweetheart. Dad and I are going to make sure of it." Ruby sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But what if the police don't listen? What if they don't believe you?" Aurora hugged her daughter tightly, fighting back her own tears. "We'll make them listen. No one gets to treat people like that, Ruby. Not even the police." The next morning, Dominic sat in his office once again, the weight of the protests and the pressure from the department pressing down on him. He had spent hours combing through Officer Miller's records, but the deeper he went, the more roadblocks he encountered. There were gaps in the files, complaints that had been buried, and too many unanswered questions. Just as he was about to close the file, his phone buzzed. It was Hugo. "Dominic, you need to come to the conference room. Now," she said, her voice urgent. When he arrived, Hugo was waiting, a file folder in her hand. Her face was pale, her expression troubled. "I found something," she said, handing him the folder. "It's about Miller, but it's bigger than that." Dominic opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. What he saw made his stomach turn. It wasn't just about Miller. There were other officers Dominic had trusted, who had been involved in covering up misconduct. And at the center of it all was Bella Ford, Bella's been protecting Miller and others like him for years, Hugo said quietly. She's buried complaints, silenced victims, and now she's trying to cover her tracks. Dominic's hands tightened around the file. I knew something was wrong, but this? It's worse than we thought, Hugo finished. And if you go after her, she won't go down without a fight. Dominic's heart pounded in his chest. He had been betrayed by the very people he thought he could trust. Now, he was left with no choice. He had to go public. As he stared at the evidence in front of him, the weight of the decision settled on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. The lines had been drawn, and Dominic knew he was about to cross them. Dominic sat at the dining table, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the folder in front of him. Inside it was enough evidence to blow open the entire Clearwater Police Department. Aurora sat across from him, her eyes filled with concern but also support. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Dominic nodded, though the weight of what he was about to do hung heavily on his shoulders. "I have to be. If I stay silent, nothing changes. This is bigger than Miller. It's bigger than me." Aurora reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens, we're in this together." He took a deep breath, then stood up, grabbing the folder. "I'm going public. They need to know the truth." Later that day, Dominic held a press conference outside the police station. The media had been circling like sharks ever since the protests began, and now they had their story. The cameras flashed, and microphones were shoved in his face. But Dominic kept his composure. "Today, I'm here not just as a police captain but as a husband and a father," Dominic began, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. "What happened to my wife, Aurora Carter, was a grave injustice committed by an officer sworn to protect, but it doesn't end with one officer. The Clearwater Police Department has a history of corruption, and I have evidence to prove it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Dominic continued, "This department has protected officers who abused their power, covered up complaints, and silenced victims. No more. It's time for justice, and it's time for the truth." As the press conference ended, reporters bombarded him with questions. His public statement had thrown the department into chaos, and there was no going back now. The backlash came quickly. Within hours of the press conference, Officer Miller and his allies launched their counterattack. A smear campaign against Dominic spread like wildfire, with rumors circulating that he had fabricated evidence to protect Aurora. Dominic sat at his desk, his phone buzzing nonstop with messages and calls. He glanced at the latest headline on his computer screen. "Police captain accused of corruption cover-up." His gut churned. Hugo Thompson, his trusted second-in-command, burst into his office. "Dominic, have you seen the news? They're coming for you." "I expected this," Dominic said, his voice tired but resolute. "Miller's not going down without a fight. But this isn't just about him. It's about the entire system." Hugo frowned. "They're accusing you of fabricating evidence. If they push this narrative hard enough, it could ruin your career." Dominic looked up at her, his expression hardening. "They can come after me all they want. I'll keep digging. The truth is on our side." Hugo hesitated, then nodded. "I'm with you, Dominic. But you need to be careful. This is bigger than you think." As the smear campaign against Dominic intensified, Aurora knew she couldn't stay silent. The community needed to hear her story, and they needed to understand the pain she had endured. Aurora sat across from Sarah Clark, a local journalist known for her hard-hitting interviews. The camera was already rolling, and Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious but empathetic. "Mrs. Carter, I know this is difficult, but can you walk us through what happened that day?" Aurora took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she remembered the fear, the helplessness. "Officer Miller pulled me over for no reason. I was with my daughter, Ruby. He became aggressive, and when I tried to comply, he struck me, in front of my child." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "I'm speaking out now because this isn't just about me. It's about every person in this town who has been silenced. This has to stop." Aurora's testimony sparked a wave of support from the community. People rallied behind her, demanding accountability from the department, but it also placed her in more danger. That evening, as she returned home from the interview, a letter was left at her doorstep. The message was simple, but chilling. Drop the case, or you'll regret it. Inside the Clearwater Police Department, the once tight-knit team was beginning to fracture. Dominic had lit a fire, and now the officers were choosing sides. Some stood behind him, tired of the corruption and ready for change. But others, loyal to Deputy Chief Bella Ford and Officer Miller, were determined to maintain the status quo. Hugo pulled Dominic aside one afternoon. "It's getting worse. The department's splitting in half. Half the officers want Miller gone, but the other half are loyal to Bella. They're not going to let this go without a fight." Dominic rubbed a hand over his face, the stress and exhaustion weighing on him. "I knew this would happen. We have to stay the course, Hugo. We can't back down now." Hugo nodded, but her eyes were filled with worry. "Just be careful. Bella's not going to let you take her down easily." Dominic glanced at the group of officers gathering in the hallway, their voices low but tense. He could feel the shift in the air. Things were about to get ugly. That evening, as Dominic was about to leave the station, Bella Ford appeared in his office doorway, her face stony. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold. Dominic leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What's this about, Bella?" Bella stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You've made a lot of enemies, Dominic. This little crusade of yours is going to get you in more trouble than you can handle." "I'm not backing down," Dominic replied, his voice firm. "I'm not going to sit by and let this department rot from the inside out." Bella's eyes narrowed, her posture tense. "You don't know what you're up against. I'm giving you one last chance. Drop this investigation or you'll lose everything. Your job, your reputation, your family's safety." Dominic's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face calm. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," Bella said, her voice low and dangerous. Dominic stood up, stepping closer to her. "I don't care what you or Miller try to do. I'm going to expose the truth, and when I do, you'll be the one answering for it." Bella's expression hardened. "You've made your choice then, but don't say I didn't warn you." As she left his office, Dominic felt the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. The lines had been drawn. There was no turning back now. He sat back down at his desk, staring at the evidence in front of him. The road ahead was going to be long and dangerous, but he knew what he had to do. The fight for justice had only just begun. The sterile walls of the Internal Affairs conference room felt suffocating as Dominic sat at the long table, facing the senior officers who had once been his colleagues. His heart thudded in his chest, but his expression remained steady. Across from him sat Deputy Chief Bella Ford, her face unreadable, and Officer Logan Miller, whose smugness was barely concealed. The hearing was a formality, an attempt by Bella and her allies to undermine Dominic's credibility and neutralize his investigation. The stakes were higher than ever. Dominic had been called in to explain his actions, why he had gone public with his findings rather than following proper channels. "Captain Carter," one of the Internal Affairs officers began, flipping through the file before him. "You've been accused of spreading misinformation and destabilizing the department by taking your findings to the media. What do you have to say for yourself?" Dominic cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I went public because the Clearwater Police Department has been systematically covering up misconduct, and I had no faith that this issue would be addressed internally. My wife was assaulted by Officer Miller, and the corruption goes far beyond one man. I have the evidence to prove it." Bella, sitting with her arms folded, leaned forward slightly, her voice dripping with contempt. "Captain, you've been a part of this department for over 20 years. If what you're claiming is true, why didn't you address these issues earlier? Why did it take a personal incident for you to suddenly see the corruption?" Dominic's jaw clenched. "I trusted this system. I believed in it. But now I realize I was blind to the reality." "That stops now." The tension in the room thickened as the senior officer leading the hearing glanced at Dominic. "Captain, We have to follow protocol. You've bypassed that process, and that's why you're here today. We will conduct a thorough review, but this could result in your suspension." Dominic felt the weight of those words but remained resolute. "Do what you have to, but I'm not backing down. The truth is coming out, whether you like it or not." While Dominic fought to clear his name at the hearing, Aurora was at home, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Ruby's sake. She sat on the porch, watching her daughter play in the yard, but her mind was far from peaceful. The threat she had received earlier was still fresh in her mind. A message left at their doorstep, warning her to drop the case. Her phone buzzed on the table next to her, and she hesitated before picking it up. It was a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over. Stop, or you'll regret it." Aurora's heart raced as she quickly deleted the message. She couldn't let Dominic know. It would only add to the pressure he was already under. But the fear clawed at her insides. She glanced at Ruby, her daughter's innocent face a reminder of everything they stood to lose. Aurora stood up, her hands trembling as she made her way into the house. She couldn't sit idly by anymore. Whoever was behind these threats was serious. And it wasn't just about her, it was about her family's safety. Later that evening, Dominic returned home from the hearing, weary but determined. As he walked through the door, Hugo Thompson was already there, pacing the living room. Aurora had called her earlier, and Dominic could see the concern etched on both of their faces. "We have a problem," Hugo said, turning to Dominic the moment he entered. "What is it?" Dominic asked, his voice tense. Hugo handed him a folder, her expression grim. "I've been doing some digging on my own. I found something big." Dominic opened the folder and scanned the contents. His eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at. Documents implicating Bella Ford in not just covering up police brutality, but also in manipulating evidence in cases across the board. It was far worse than he had anticipated. "Bella's been involved in this from the start," Hugo said quietly. "And it doesn't end with Miller. She's been protecting multiple officers, all while silencing victims. Some of these cases go back years." Dominic's stomach twisted. This is enough to bring her down." "But it puts a target on you," Hugo added. "If Bella knows you have this, she'll come for you." Aurora stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "We have to go public with this. We can't let her get away with it." Dominic nodded, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. "I'll confront her, but this time I'm bringing her down for good." The next morning, Dominic marched into the Clearwater Police Department with the folder tucked under his arm. His pulse pounded in his ears as he made his way to Bella's office. He pushed open the door without knocking, catching Bella mid-conversation with Officer Miller. "Dominic," Bella said, her voice cold and sharp, "what are you doing here?" Dominic slammed the folder onto her desk. "It's over, Bella." Bella's eyes flicked to the folder, her expression faltering for the briefest moment before she recovered. "What is this?" "Evidence," Dominic said, his voice steady. "Evidence that you've been covering up misconduct, falsifying records, and protecting corrupt officers. You're done." Bella's face hardened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Dominic shot back. "You've been burying complaints for years. I've got the proof. You've protected men like Miller while letting innocent people suffer. And now, I'm going to make sure the whole town knows." Miller stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You don't have anything, Carter. This is just another desperate move." Dominic didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." Bella's hands clenched on the desk. "You're making a big mistake, Dominic. If you think you can take me down, you're wrong. I've spent my entire career building this department, and I won't let you destroy it." "You destroyed it yourself," Dominic said quietly. "And now, you're going to pay for it." Bella stood, her eyes blazing with fury. "You have no idea what you've started." But Dominic was already turning to leave. His decision made. He was taking Bella down, no matter the cost. That evening, Dominic, Aurora, and Hugo gathered at the Carter home, sitting around the kitchen table with papers spread out before them. The air was thick with tension, as they prepared for the next steps. "This is it," Hugo said, her voice calm but determined. "We take this to court, and we blow the whole thing wide open." Dominic nodded, though the exhaustion was evident in his eyes. "We have enough to bring her down, but we need to be careful. Bella's not going to go down without a fight." Aurora, her hand resting on Dominic's, spoke up. "Whatever happens, we're in this together. She can't break us." Hugo leaned forward, her eyes locking with Dominic's. "We've come too far to back down now. Bella may have the power, but we have the truth, and that's what's going to win." As the night wore on, the three of them continued to strategize, knowing that the final battle was just beginning. The evidence was ready, the case was solid, and the town of Clearwater was about to witness the fall of an empire built on lies. Dominic sat back in his chair, glancing at Aurora and Hugo. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. The fight for justice was far from over, but they were ready. "We're going to win this," Dominic said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "And when we do, Clearwater will never be the same." The day of the trial dawned gray and cold, but inside the packed courthouse, tension crackled in the air like a storm ready to break. Dominic, wearing a dark suit and tie, sat beside his lawyer, Monica Gaines, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. Across the room, Bella Ford sat with her own legal team, her face a mask of cold indifference. Officer Logan Miller was present too, his smug expression unshaken, as if he still believed his connections would save him. Aurora sat in the front row, her hands tightly gripping the armrests, while Hugo stood just behind them, a pillar of support for Dominic. The crowd behind them buzzed with murmurs. Clearwater had come out in full force to witness the trial that would either expose or bury the corruption in the police department. As the judge entered the courtroom, the room fell into a tense silence. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the trial officially began. Monica wasted no time laying out the case, her voice clear and confident. "We're here today to seek justice, not just for Aurora Carter, but for every citizen of Clearwater who has been failed by the very people sworn to protect them. The evidence will show that Deputy Chief Bella Ford and Officer Logan Miller, among others, have systematically covered up misconduct, manipulated records, and protected abusive officers within the Clearwater Police Department." Monica's words sent a ripple through the courtroom, but Dominic kept his focus forward. This was it, the moment they had been fighting for. While the trial proceeded inside the courthouse, a large crowd gathered outside. Protesters held signs demanding justice, chanting, "No more corruption," and "Justice for Aurora." The media captured every moment, broadcasting the trial to the rest of the town and beyond. Inside, Aurora glanced at Dominic, giving him a small, reassuring smile. The community was behind them, but the pressure of what was at stake weighed heavily on both of them. It wasn't just about clearing Dominic's name or seeking justice for the assault. This trial would determine the future of the entire Clearwater Police Department. As witnesses were called, one after another, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew more charged. Monica called on several former officers who had filed complaints against Miller, all of which had been dismissed or covered up by Bella and her team. Their testimonies painted a clear picture of the corrupt practices that had been allowed to fester for years. Hugo took the stand next, her voice steady as she recounted her own findings during her investigation. "It wasn't just about one bad officer," she said, looking directly at the jury. "It was an entire system designed to protect those in power and silence anyone who stood up against it." Her words resonated with the crowd, and the tension in the room shifted. Bella, who had maintained her cold demeanor throughout the trial, finally showed signs of cracking. Her jaw tightened, and she exchanged a few quiet, tense words with her lawyer. As the day wore on, the trial took a dramatic turn. Monica presented a series of documents that had been carefully hidden within the department's records. Documents that detailed how Bella Ford had been embezzling funds meant for department improvements, diverting them to personal accounts. The embezzlement was a shocking twist no one had expected, not even Miller, who looked stunned when the evidence was revealed. The courtroom erupted in gasps as Monica explained the depth of Bella's deceit. This isn't just about corruption within the police department. This is about a leader who betrayed the trust of an entire town, lining her pockets while turning a blind eye to the misconduct of her officers. Bella's face turned pale, and for the first time she appeared visibly shaken. Her lawyer frantically whispered in her ear, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The jury, who had been watching with cautious expressions, now looked at Bella with clear disgust. Dominic felt a wave of vindication wash over him. They had her. This was the moment they had been waiting for. But he knew they couldn't celebrate just yet. There was still more to come. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was only a matter of minutes. When they finally returned to the courtroom, everyone held their breath, waiting for the decision that would change everything. The foreman of the jury stood and cleared his throat. In the case of Captain Dominic Carter versus Deputy Chief Bella Ford, we find the defendant, Bella Ford, guilty of corruption, obstruction of justice, and embezzlement. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by a ripple of applause from the gallery. The judge banged his gavel to restore order, but the damage had already been done. Bella Ford had been found guilty. The once powerful deputy chief was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her head hanging low. Dominic let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Beside him, Aurora reached for his hand, her eyes brimming with tears of relief. They had won, but the victory was bittersweet. Officer Miller had been convicted of assault, but his sentence was lighter than Dominic had hoped. Still, the truth had been brought to light, and that was what mattered most. As Miller was led away, he cast a final, hateful glance at Dominic, but Dominic didn't care. Miller's time in Clearwater was over, and the department would never be the same. In the days that followed the trial, Clearwater was a town in transition. The police department had begun the process of implementing major reforms, with several other corrupt officers removed from their positions. New leadership was installed, and Dominic's actions had ignited a fire within the community, a desire for real change. But Dominic knew he couldn't stay. The victory had come at a cost, and the department he had once dedicated his life to was no longer a place he felt he belonged. He had done what he needed to do, but now it was time to move on. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Dominic and Aurora sat on the porch, watching Ruby play in the yard. The weight of everything they had been through still lingered, but there was also a sense of peace. "You did it," Aurora said quietly, resting her head on Dominic's shoulder. "You brought them down." "We did it," Dominic corrected, his voice soft. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Aurora smiled, squeezing his hand. "What happens now?" Dominic took a deep breath, gazing out at the horizon. "I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that. We'll figure it out together." As the sounds of the neighborhood drifted through the air, Dominic felt a sense of closure. The fight for justice in Clearwater wasn't over, but his part in it had come to an end. And now, for the first time in months, he could finally look forward to a future where he and his family were free from the shadows of corruption. They had fought the system and won, and now they were ready to start anew. The sun was beginning to rise over Clearwater as Dominic sat on the porch, sipping his morning coffee. The trial was over, but the sense of peace he had hoped for hadn't fully settled. Aurora stepped out of the house, joining him on the porch, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft, filled with concern. Dominic gave a small nod. "I think so. It's just that everything's different now. I thought once we won, I'd feel relief, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all." Aurora sat beside him, her eyes focused on the horizon. "It's going to take time, Dominic, but we did what we set out to do. We exposed the truth." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the weight of everything they'd been through. "I know, but I can't help but feel like I've lost something too. The department was my life for so long. Now, I don't know where I fit." Aurora took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not lost. You're free. Free to decide what comes next on your terms. And you don't have to do it alone." Dominic smiled, grateful for her steady presence. I guess it's time to figure out what this new beginning looks like." Later that day, Dominic and Aurora took Ruby to her first counseling session. The events of the past few months had weighed heavily on their daughter, and they knew she needed help processing everything she'd witnessed. As they sat in the waiting room, Ruby fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, her eyes avoiding theirs. Dominic knelt down beside her, his voice gentle. "You know this is just to help you feel better, right?" Ruby nodded slowly but remained silent. Aurora knelt beside her as well, brushing a hand through her daughter's braids. "It's okay to talk about what happened, sweetie. We just want you to feel safe again." Ruby finally looked up, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't like thinking about it. I just want it to go away." Dominic's heart ached, but he kept his voice steady. "I know. And talking about it will help it go away, bit by bit." After a long pause, Ruby nodded again, this time with more conviction. The counselor came to greet them, and Ruby hesitantly followed her inside. As Dominic and Aurora watched their daughter disappear into the room, they exchanged a glance filled with hope. "She'll be okay," Aurora whispered, more to reassure herself than anyone. Dominic wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Yeah, she will. We all will." Weeks passed, and Dominic found himself back in the heart of Clearwater, but this time in a very different role. He had left the police force, but he couldn't leave the fight for justice behind. Now, he was working with community organizations to oversee the reforms taking place within the Clearwater Police Department. He stood in the same building he had once walked through as captain, but the atmosphere was different. New leadership had been installed, and several corrupt officers had been removed. Dominic spoke with the new police chief, a man determined to rebuild trust between the department and the community. "I've seen what happens when good officers turn a blind eye," Dominic said. "This department can't just make surface changes. You need to root out every bit of corruption if you want to regain the town's trust." The chief nodded, his expression serious. "We're committed to doing things the right way this time, and I'm glad you're here to hold us accountable." As Dominic left the meeting, a sense of pride swelled within him. He had sacrificed his career, but it wasn't for nothing. Real change was happening, and Clearwater was starting to heal. One evening, a community event was held in the town center to honor Dominic, Aurora, and all those who had fought to bring justice to Clearwater. The air was warm, filled with the sound of laughter and music as families gathered to celebrate the hard-won victory. Dominic and Aurora stood near the stage, watching as the mayor stepped up to the microphone. "Tonight, we honor the bravery of two people who refused to back down in the face of corruption," the mayor began. "Dominic and Aurora Carter, you fought for justice, not just for your family, but for the entire town, and for that, we thank you." Applause erupted from the crowd, and Dominic felt a swell of emotion. Aurora squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with pride. As they walked through the crowd afterward, people stopped them to offer their thanks, their gratitude for what the Carters had done. For the first time in months, Dominic felt lighter, knowing that their fight had made a difference. Later that night, Dominic and Aurora sat on their porch, watching Ruby play in the yard with some neighborhood children. The soft sounds of their laughter filled the air, and for the first time, peace settled over them. Aurora leaned back in her chair, a contented smile on her face. "We made it," Dominic nodded, his hand resting over hers. "Yeah, we did." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky turned a deep shade of blue. The fight for justice had been hard, but it had also brought them closer as a family. They had faced down corruption, fear, and uncertainty, and come out stronger on the other side. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Aurora asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Dominic smiled, his heart full of love for the woman beside him. "I used to think I needed a plan, a next step, but now I'm okay with just being here, with you, with Ruby. We'll figure out the rest as it comes." Aurora leaned her head on his shoulder, her eyes closing in contentment. "That sounds perfect." As the last of the sunlight faded and the stars began to appear in the sky, Dominic and Aurora knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The fight for justice was never really over, but for now, they could finally enjoy the peace they had fought so hard to find.